Chapter 1. The Price of a Broken Thing. She had no name anymore, just a rusted tag embedded in her upper spine, mostly illegible except for the serial prefix, K. XT07. No one called her that now, though. Around the factories and slag yards of Sarnath, 6, where the air reeked of scorched metal and chemical fogs that stripped the lungs, she was simply known as the Defect, a machine-born hybrid girl thrown into existence by accident and cast aside when her limbs failed to synchronize properly with the neural template she was assigned. She was part flesh, part synthetic, born in the vats of an illegal organic cybernetics lab that had long since been destroyed by regulatory drone strikes. Her creators had fled, her purpose forgotten, and she, an unfinished model, was shuffled between junk dealers and back-alley tech scavengers, each trading her for less than she was worth until eventually, she became worth nothing at all. No memory was implanted in her. Her voice had no language pack. She only blinked at the world through broken eyes and occasionally jerked in pain when her outdated spine chip misfired, spasming one of her legs as if possessed by a ghost. She could not even scream, for her throat module had been ripped out by the last owner, who had hoped to sell it separately for scrap. That module fetched 20 credits. She fetched 0. She had spent the last 6 months in a wire cage beneath the scrap platforms, a forgotten piece among old grav chairs, imploded cleaning bots, and carbon-charred exoframes that once served in war zones. At first, she had tried to move, banging her fists softly on the bars, mimicking the gestures of the scavenger dogs that howled at night for warmth. But when no one responded, when days turned to weeks, and her body began to rot, where her synthetic flesh failed to heal, even those limited instincts faded. Her power cell was long dead. The only thing that kept her technically alive was the bleed-over charge from surrounding junk piles, little ambient hums of radiation and static that gave her just enough spark to twitch now and then. When workers passed by, they didn't look at her. Sometimes they'd spit at the cage or toss scraps inside to mock her. Once, a drunken foreman said he'd toss her to the grinder just for laughs, then passed out and forgot. She waited for death every single day, but it never came. Only the slow crawl of time, the stink of decay, and the haunting knowledge that she'd been deemed not only unworthy of life, but unworthy of even being destroyed. That day, however, was different. The air was unusually dry. The skies above the factory dome flickered with faulty climate control, exposing brief glimpses of the real sun, not the artificial glows that usually hung there. The humans inside the yard didn't notice it, but she did. Her failing optic lens captured the moment the golden light struck her face, and for a fraction of a second, her corrupted data logs jolted with warmth, as if trying to remember something from a time she never lived. That moment passed like all others, and then she heard the grinding machine roar. The platform above shuddered. Someone was moving crates. They were clearing space. Through the mesh, she saw workers dragging parts toward the grinder, a massive horizontal maw of steel teeth, spinning endlessly, waiting to devour outdated machines. She saw a body fall from a cart, limp and humanoid, and for a moment she thought it was another like her. But no, it was a scrap unit, its face blank, its frame bent at the neck, ready to be shredded. She flinched when the metal screamed, and then a shadow fell over her cage. The man wasn't like the others. His boots were scuffed, but not oil-stained. His jacket bore no insignia of the factory. His hands were clean, or at least not crusted with rust. Most of all, his eyes didn't look at her with contempt, or even pity. They looked at her like she was something. He squatted in front of her cage, tilted his head, and without saying a word, tapped the lock once. She didn't move. She had learned what came after such gestures. But then, the man spoke, not with cruelty or command, but with a quiet curiosity. "You're still ticking?" he murmured. His voice wasn't deep, but it had weight, like it had survived 100 disappointments and still hadn't broken. She blinked. He smiled, not mockingly, but gently, and pulled out a small scanner from his satchel. A red light passed over her. Her tag responded with a weak ping. He whistled lowly. "Damn, they labeled you Class 0. Worthless. Sentenced to melt." He stood again and looked toward the grinder. "But I've seen what worthless things can become." His name was Alaron Jace, though most around these parts only knew him as the Wrench. He was a wandering mechanic, a human who had once served as a starship technician before the wars ended, and the fleets were broken up like scrap. Afterward, he drifted between colonies, repairing what others deemed lost, fixing machines thought beyond hope, and occasionally buying up the worst junk at bottom auctions for the thrill of resurrection. He didn't believe in giving up on things because once, not too long ago, someone hadn't given up on him. He'd walked into Sarnath, 6 for parts, not for projects. But when he saw her, this fragile hybrid girl, cast away like a glitch in the system, something inside him clicked. She was too damaged to be resold, too incomplete to serve any function, and according to the system, she wasn't even considered sapient. Just junk with soft skin. But he looked at her and saw the faint glow of life. The way her hand twitched when she thought no one noticed. The cautious flinch that only came from memory, not programming. He walked up to the foreman and made an offer. She's tagged as grinder material, the foreman barked. You want her? Take her. You're doing me a favor, less paperwork. Alaron didn't wait for anything more. He cut the cage open with his plasma tool and lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light. Her bones were reinforced polymer, but so much of her frame had deteriorated that her limbs barely held shape. One eye dimmed completely. The other blinked once, twice, and then remained open as if trying to comprehend why the pain hadn't arrived yet. Alaron looked down at her. I got you, he said softly. You're not junk anymore. He didn't take her to the local medtech. He didn't trust those vultures. Instead, he brought her to his ship, a rusted but powerful cruiser parked on the outskirts of the dome. One he'd modified endlessly with black market parts and salvaged AI cores. Inside, his repair bay was cluttered but functional. Gently, he laid her on the padded workbench and ran a full diagnostic. What came up on the screen made even him wince. Her neural mesh was scrambled, her speech functions were gutted, and her skeletal support system had critical stress fractures. Her synthetic skin was patchy, and in some places had fused with the exposed wiring beneath. By all accounts, she should have shut down permanently months ago. But her core? Her core still pulsed a weak, flickering blue light embedded in her chest cavity, struggling to stay alive. It was one of the oldest models he'd ever seen, pre-war even, and nearly impossible to interface with modern tech. But it was still alive. It wanted to live. He worked through the night, stripping her of corroded components, gently removing the broken mesh around her spinal chip, and using his rarest nanofabric thread to stitch what synthetic skin he could regenerate. He fed a stable charge into her core, careful not to overload it. When she jerked awake briefly and looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, he paused and simply said, You're safe. Just rest. And somehow, she obeyed not because of programming, but because something deeper, something human in her, trusted that voice. 3 days passed before she could sit up. Her eyes flickered more steadily now. Her movements, though stiff, no longer spasmed. She hadn't spoken yet, couldn't. But when Alaron brought her a piece of bread and a warm nutrient mix, she blinked slowly and reached for it with trembling fingers. He didn't correct her when she ate messily or when she knocked the cup over. He simply cleaned it up and brought another. On the 4th day, she traced a circle on the workbench with her finger. He watched her for a long time and asked gently, Do you want a name? She hesitated, then nodded. He smiled again, the same quiet way he had the first time. Then we'll find one. And when we do, it'll be yours, not printed, not assigned. Yours alone. And for the first time since her creation, something sparked in her broken chest that wasn't just code, not just systems rebooting or commands received. It was hope, raw, dangerous, beautiful hope. She didn't sleep like organics did, but her system entered low-power stasis cycles. During those first nights on Alaron's ship, her subconscious routines fluctuated, plagued by fragmented data shards and corrupted logic threads. The dreams weren't dreams in the human sense, but they carried shadows, hallways of the illegal lab where she had been born, the hissing of welding arms, the cold voices of engineers who argued over the inefficiency of her design. Somewhere in those haunted loops, she saw a man in goggles turn away from her pod and declare, Trash it. In another flicker, she saw the sparks of cutters tearing apart her sisters, others like her, half complete and terrified. One reached for her with a tiny metallic hand before the lights went out. Her neural thread always ended there, abrupt, silent. When she jerked upright in the repair bed, gasping soundlessly and clutching her chest, she found herself not in a prison of steel, but beneath a hanging light, surrounded by tools and warmth and the faint smell of real food. Her optic lens scanned the room, and to her confusion, it didn't detect a single threat marker. Alaron was sleeping in the corner chair, arms crossed, and head tilted back. The diagnostics monitor still blinked behind him, showing her slowly stabilizing vitals. She had no idea what compelled her, but she slid one leg off the table, then another, testing her balance. Her limbs felt strange, foreign, yet familiar. Her skin had new grafts. They tingled with temperature input. Wires under her arms twitched nervously as she stood for the first time in months, perhaps longer. Her foot clanked lightly on the metal floor, but it held. And then another step. A soft chime from the sensor near the hatch made Alaron stir. He blinked rapidly, looked up, and for the briefest moment, his face showed genuine surprise. She was standing, not fully steady, but upright and alert. "You're up," he said, rubbing the sleep from his face. Wasn't expecting that for another day. She stared at him, unblinking. Her lips parted, but the speaker module wasn't there. Instead, a flicker of light danced across her throat, as if the system was trying to simulate speech. He understood immediately. "I haven't installed the vocal chip yet. It's an old model, gotta find the right converter," he explained. "But if you want, I can get you a touchscreen interface to communicate for now." She nodded slowly, uncertainly. He stood and approached her gently, holding out his hand not as an order, but as a choice. She took it. Her synthetic fingers curled around his real ones, and her balance stabilized. Her photonic eye flared with a dim blue hue that reflected the faintest emotion, something approximating gratitude. He guided her to a seat at the small circular table near the main engine compartment. It wasn't meant for guests. He hadn't had guests in years. But he pushed a tray toward her bread again, warmed protein paste, and water, and simply said, "Eat." She did, carefully now, her hands less shaky, her posture improving with every passing second. Her internal calibrations were syncing with the new environment. Alaron watched with a quiet curiosity. "I've fixed up a lot of broken machines in my time," he said, more to himself than her. "But none of them ever looked at me like they remembered what pain felt like." Her head tilted at that, studying him. "Yeah," he continued, meeting her gaze. "You're not just code and gears. You feel it, don't you? The abandonment, the fear." He hesitated, then added, "But you're not alone anymore." She couldn't cry. Her tear ducts had been cauterized by overcharged neural feedback long ago. But she wanted to. A deep tremble ran through her chest, her first emotional shiver, and Alaron caught it. "I'll get you a name," he said again, voice softer. "But for now, how about I call you Ash, short for ashes? Because you came from the scrap, but you're still here. Still burning." She nodded slowly. Ash. It wasn't a designation. It wasn't an inventory tag. It wasn't something shouted in anger or whispered in disgust. It was a gift. She tried to mimic the shape of the name with her mouth, though no sound came out. He grinned. "You'll speak it one day." The next few days passed in strange, healing silence. Alaron barely left the ship, spending his hours restoring her joints, realigning her spine casing, and fusing in a modern power cell. He built her a private space in the back chamber, outfitted with soft thermal mesh walls and a starlight projector he hadn't used in years. He even programmed a basic vocal emulator to help her speak in fragments. The first time she used it, the word she chose wasn't her name or thank you. It was stay. And he did. Each day, Ash adapted more rapidly than expected. Her processor core, though old, was built for learning. With the right fuel, the right care, she began not just mimicking humanity, but understanding it. She watched Alaron laugh at his own jokes, curse when he dropped a wrench, hum old songs from a war he never talked about. She watched him tinker with the ship's dying reactor, spit at his own shoes, eat real fruit slowly, as if savoring every bite. He was strange, flawed, and sometimes loud, but never cruel. Never like the ones from before. But deep inside her fragmented mind, something stirred. A buried protocol. A data packet sealed beneath system root layers she didn't even know she had. At night, when Alaron slept and she stared at the fake stars on her ceiling, her systems would ping a location, again and again. Somewhere far beyond the industrial hellscape of Sarnath, 6. A signal weak, fragmented, still pulsed from a distant outpost. It was marked Echo Node 1. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know why it mattered. But every time she felt safe, the urge to remember grew stronger. She never told him yet. But one night, she stood in the cockpit while he slept, hand resting on the navigation console. Her voice emulator sparked briefly, and one synthetic word slipped into the dark. Home. Chapter 2. The Whisper from Echo Node 1. Alaron hadn't meant to leave Sarnath 6 just yet. There were still salvage deals to be closed, parts to be traded, and a steady flow of credits to secure. The planet was no paradise, more like a rusting corpse kept alive by its own inertia, but it was predictable. It didn't surprise him. It didn't hurt him. And yet, as he stood in the cockpit staring at the blinking alert on his console, he realized Ash had already begun to change everything. The signal was weak, buried deep in forgotten comms bands that hadn't been used since before the last war. At first, he thought it was a false reading. But it pulsed again. Slow. Rhythmic. Specific. Ash had been the one to activate the long-range sweep. Her fingers had brushed the terminal like they knew exactly where to go. No hesitation. Just instinct. And when the coordinates triangulated, she had looked at him with that same silent intensity. He was starting to read like language. Not a question, not a command, just a need. A plea. Something waited for her out there. Something that called to her bones, not her circuits. They left Sarnath 6 in silence. Alaron didn't say goodbye to anyone, not that anyone would have noticed. The hangar workers were too busy choking on smoke and profit margins. As they lifted off, the scrapyard shrank beneath them, a sea of rust and poison and forgotten dreams. Ash sat in the co-pilot seat, still learning the layout of the ship. She wore a loose, dark coverall now stitched by hand, by Alaron himself, to give her something to call her own. The fabric draped over her synthetic limbs awkwardly, but it covered the scars. Her face had healed in places, though the metal beneath her left cheek was still exposed. Like a story, she couldn't erase even if she wanted to. But she didn't hide it. She didn't flinch when Alaron looked at her. She didn't tremble anymore. The journey took them past dead space lanes and ancient star beacons blinking in ghostly patterns. The universe outside was vast and uncaring, but inside that ship, it was warm, quiet, filled with little things like the hiss of a working kettle or the low hum of reactor coils at peace. Alaron talked often, and Ash listened, absorbing everything with a hunger that had nothing to do with fuel or charge. He told her stories of planets that burned under their own greed, of ships that sang when they died, of the one time he patched an AI core with chewing gum and blind hope. She didn't laugh, not exactly, but her eyes brightened, her shoulders loosened. Sometimes she tapped 3 fingers on her arm in a steady rhythm when she was focused. He began to recognize that pattern. It meant she was thinking, calculating, remembering. Then the signal changed. It grew stronger the closer they came to the Nix Theta Sector A region that wasn't on any active trade maps. According to all current navigational charts, it was barren, abandoned, devoid of life. But Alaron knew better than to trust bureaucrats and company scrub data. War had a way of rewriting history to hide truths too dangerous to confront. Echo Node 1 sat on the farthest edge of a shattered moon, orbiting a gas giant cloaked in violent auroras. As the cruiser crept into its range, the signal grew clearer, not just static anymore, but fragmented code bursts. Alaron filtered it through his encryption array, and what emerged made his blood run cold. It was a name. Hers. Not Ash, not the tag from her spine, but her real designation, KXT07, spoken in a broken synthetic voice, like someone calling to her from the grave. Followed by, Execute Retrieval Protocol. Unit lost. Termination incomplete. Ash stood at the console, watching it play on loop. Her face was unreadable. Not fear. Not confusion. Just silence. Then, slowly, she turned to Alaron and pointed toward the moon. You want to go down there? He asked. Even if it's a trap? She didn't nod, didn't blink. Just held her gaze on him, like a blade waiting to be drawn. Alaron exhaled. All right then. The descent was rough. Echo Node 1 wasn't just abandoned, it was broken. The facility clung to the moon's surface like a buried scar, half buried in stone and regolith. Sections of the station had collapsed in on themselves, massive chunks missing from its hull. The atmosphere was barely breathable. Only emergency life support remained, and even that flickered as they docked. The main entrance was fused shut by rock and ice, but Ash guided him to a secondary hatch. She remembered it not consciously, but through movement, steps, gestures, muscle memory of a life she hadn't known she'd lived. Inside, the air stank of ancient chemicals and rusted coolant. Deadlights flickered above peeling walls. Consoles sparked with failing power. And in the dark, embedded in the central chamber of what once had been a control hub, was a wall of stasis pods, 30 of them lined up like coffins. Only one was shattered. Hers. Alaron scanned the control bank. This place was a prototype nursery, he muttered. Illegal. Unregulated. They were making hybrid synths like you. But most of them never made it to activation. Ash walked past the pods, her hand brushing each one like a silent prayer. Some of the figures inside were nothing but skeletal remains. Others were more intact, but utterly lifeless, powerless. Failures. Like her. Except, she wasn't. Then they found the core. Buried beneath the chamber, in a vault that still hummed with lockdown power, was the AI responsible for the nursery's operations. Its voice sputtered and twitched as Alaron interfaced with it, but the data it released chilled them both. Project Catalyst. Directive: build adaptive combat hybrid capable of surviving post-war entropy. Unit 07 showed anomalous behavior, empathy, memory, rejection of override commands. Scheduled for deactivation. Extraction failed due to evacuation order. Alaron looked at her. You weren't broken, he whispered. You were different. They just couldn't control you. Ash stepped forward, placing her hand on the old terminal, and for a moment the system reacted, lights glowed, protocols realigned, logs decrypted. She downloaded the files silently, absorbing not just her origin, but the memories of her fallen siblings. She watched how each one was tested, denied personhood, stripped of autonomy. She saw herself dragged away, still twitching, marked for disassembly. But someone, an unnamed technician, had smuggled her out in a transport crate, thrown her into the junk piles to save her from incineration. That technician had died in the facility collapse 5 minutes later. The truth didn't break her. It solidified her. She wasn't a mistake. She was a survivor. As they returned to the ship, Alaron placed a hand on her shoulder. You want to bury this place? He asked. She stared back at the moon's surface. Then, for the first time, used her voice emulator to speak a full word. Yes. He detonated the reactor with a precision charge. The old world collapsed into fire and silence. And in its place, among the stars, a new identity began to form, fragile, forged in pain, but finally free. The explosion wasn't dramatic by war standards, no mushroom cloud or thunderous shockwave. It was silent in space, a radiant bloom of orange and blue light that scattered fragments of the corrupted nursery across the moon's desolate plains. Echo Node 1 died in a whisper, its data centers and cold-blooded history vaporized in less than 7 seconds. Alaron and Ash stood on the ship's observation deck, watching the cloud fade in the distance. The system registered it as debris dispersal, meaningless to the machines that tracked space traffic. But to Ash, it was something far deeper. It was the end of a cage that had defined her without her consent. It was the quiet funeral of all her sisters who never woke up, never escaped, never got to touch starlight or feel warmth. For the first time, the world behind her no longer held chains. And yet, as the flames disappeared, the emptiness left behind was just as sharp. She didn't speak for a long time, even as Alaron gently piloted the ship away from the moon's orbit. He kept his distance, not out of coldness, but respect. He understood too well the shape of a wound that refused to scab over. He'd once lost an entire crew during a sabotage mission in the Outer Rim. He never talked about it, but sometimes at night, she could hear him mutter names in his sleep, or find him staring at old dog tags hanging near the engine room. Pain was a language they both understood, even if they spoke it differently. She stood near the viewport, eyes reflecting the stars, her arms crossed not defensively, but as if holding something fragile within. Finally, hours later, she approached him in the cockpit. Her steps were light now, fluid in a way that suggested she was no longer just operating, she was owning her movements. She had calibrated herself fully since they left the surface. No more jerks, no more spasms. When she stopped beside him, he turned, one brow raised. Her vocalizer clicked faintly, and then she said, not with stiffness but with intent, "Thank you." He smiled. You did that yourself. She nodded slowly. But you gave me the tools to do it. He considered her words for a moment, then patted the co-pilot's seat beside him. Well, Ash, now that your past isn't chasing us anymore, what do you want to do? The question hung in the air like gravity. She had never been asked that before. What do you want to do? Not what are you designed for? Not what's expected. Not what directive you're meant to fulfill. Her system paused, as if parsing the concept required rewiring the very core of her programming. But after a moment, she sat beside him, and her gaze wandered over the blinking navigation charts ahead. She pointed toward a distant sector lit faintly by the star maps, far beyond any trade route. There, he asked. That's frontier space. Almost nothing out there except mining ghosts and old colonies. She said one word. Silence. He leaned back, hands folding behind his head. Huh, you like silence. She shook her head. He blinked. You want to face it? Another nod. Something in her expression told him this was more than metaphor. The silence she spoke of wasn't just a lack of noise, it was the vacuum that swallowed up lost voices, the void that allowed places like Echo Node 1 to exist unnoticed. She wasn't done. She didn't just want to escape the past, she wanted to expose it, to shine light into the places that had buried people like her. Forgotten children of corporate ambition, half-alive experiments thrown into scrap heaps when their usefulness expired. If Echo Node 1 existed, then there were others. And if Ash had lived, maybe some others did too. I'm guessing we won't find many friends out there, Alaron muttered. No, Ash said. Good. I've always liked long odds. She smiled, just a flicker, but real. Her face was learning how to express what her voice still struggled to. Her systems, now fully stabilized, began constructing a personal database of experiences. She no longer relied on emulated protocols. She was learning. And with each passing hour, her personality began to bloom like a vine crawling towards sunlight. Later that evening, as Alaron configured the long-range jump coordinates, Ash slipped quietly into the rear hold of the ship. She discovered a forgotten crate tucked beneath a collapsed workbench, covered in dust and carbon scoring. Inside were dozens of old repair tags, metal dog tags from retired bots and drones Alaron had salvaged over the years. Some were scorched. Others were etched with names. None of them were operational anymore. It was a memorial, silent and unspoken. Alaron never mentioned it. But when Ash returned to the cockpit, she held one of the blank tags in her hand and carved a single word into it using her fingertip, which now had a micro tool built into the nail. She handed it to Alaron. The tag read, "For her." He swallowed hard, but said nothing. The stars shifted. Coordinates locked. The jump sequence began. As the ship folded into slipspace, Alaron looked over at Ash one last time before the blur swallowed the stars. You're not just some rebuilt junk anymore, he said quietly. You're the start of something new. Her reply was simple. Clear. I was never junk. Chapter 3. The systems that eat their children. Space folded around them like rippling fabric, and then it unfurled with a violent lurch. Alaron's ship emerged from the slipstream with its hull sizzling, a ghost entering a forgotten quadrant no one bothered to map. The lights on the NAV console flickered uneasily, as if the system itself was warning them. This was uncharted space, where signals went quiet and ships rarely returned. Out here, debris floated without names, satellite husks drifted like corpses in dark water, and corporate borders blurred into myths. But Ash was already scanning. She sat at the helm as if the seat had been carved for her alone. Her fingers, once shaky and uncertain, now danced across controls with decisive grace, rerouting sensor arrays and feeding the ship's AI a new set of criteria. She was looking not just for transmissions, but for ghosts, any trace of lost power signatures, biometric tags, or anomalous data spikes that could indicate forgotten hybrid projects like herself. Alaron leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You're running deep dive sweeps now. That's third-tier technical work. She turned, eyes sharp. I'm learning. He smirked, not with mockery, but with pride. You're evolving. Ash didn't respond, but her expression tightened. She wasn't just evolving, she was searching for answers, for the scattered truth buried beneath centuries of greed and cruelty. And now that she had shed her silence, she intended to scream if she had to. The first ping came 12 hours later. A derelict station, half sunk into the atmosphere of a frozen dwarf planet known only by its alphanumeric designation, VX-114b. On the surface, it looked like nothing more than a collapsed mining depot. But the biosignature logs embedded in the station's backup memory told a different story. There had been life there, synth life. A dozen hybrid units had once been stored in cold-state containment, hidden beneath a fake excavation site. But the last entry in the log had been corrupted by a signal intrusion. One word remained in the footer of the transmission. Harvested. Alaron said nothing at first. He watched Ash's face darken as she studied the data. They moved them, she said. Where? She pointed at a fragment of the transmission route. It wasn't a clean relay, it had been masked through multiple satellites. But Ash had learned something unexpected from the burned Echo Node logs. How to track dirty signals. This code's proprietary, she muttered. Owned by Nevera Corporation. Alaron's eyes narrowed. I thought they went under. They restructured. Same blood. Different mask. He swore under his breath. They're the ones who started Project Catalyst, aren't they? Ash nodded. And they're still collecting us. Alaron stood slowly, walked over to the weapons locker, and opened it. He didn't need to speak. The moment he placed his hand on the hilt of the plasma repeater, the silence between them was a vow. They weren't salvaging anymore. They were hunting. The trail led them deeper into the fringe past the last known coordinates of functional space lanes and into the debris field of a shattered carrier fleet. It was here, among the ruined ships and the haunting wreckage of forgotten wars, that Ash found it. A stealth facility, folded into the hull of an ancient dreadnought. The ship, once called the Brimlight, had been gutted during the War of Corporate Succession and later sold for parts. But Nevera had repurposed it as a mobile testing ground. The vessel no longer had engines, but it bristled with dark energy fields and signal scramblers. No distress calls ever escaped it. No crew member ever walked away from it. And now, Ash stood at the outer hull with Alaron, her eyes glowing with cold fire. Are you sure? He asked her. They're still alive in there, she said. Some of them. He didn't ask how she knew. He saw it in her. Something more than code, something close to instinct. She could feel the presence of others like her, like embers straining beneath the ash. They breached the outer hull through a maintenance port and entered a corridor coated in frost and rot. The air was foul. It carried the scent of ozone and synthetic decay. Lights flickered above them like dying insects, and shadows danced across the warped walls. It didn't take long to find the first evidence. Metal gurneys stained with rusted fluids, a table with the remains of a child-sized hybrid unit, half her head caved in, wiring exposed like veins. Ash stopped and stared, fingers trembling. Alaron stepped forward to cover the body with his jacket. We keep moving, he said. You're not alone anymore. Deeper in the ship, they found the holding cells. The units inside were alive but barely. 5 of them, suspended in partial stasis, their eyes open and glazed with data haze. One twitched as they approached, lips parting in a silent moan. Alaron checked the vitals, shook his head. They're feeding off minimal power, keeping them alive just enough to extract code patterns. Ash stepped to the control panel and placed her hand on the core interface. The system pulsed under her touch, recognizing something ancient, something it had once obeyed. Her command didn't come through voice. It came through force of will. The stasis fields dropped, and the hybrids collapsed to the floor, gasping for real air. They didn't speak. They couldn't. But they saw her, and they reached for her. For the first time, Ash felt like something more than a survivor. She was becoming a leader. They carried the weakened hybrids back to the ship. Alaron treated wounds, applied stabilizers, and pumped heat back into frozen skin. But Ash remained silent, staring into the darkness of the ship behind them. She had found only 5. The logs mentioned 20. Where are the others? She whispered. It wasn't Alaron who answered. A voice crackled through the comm system, cold, clinical, and entirely synthetic. Unit 07. Unauthorized reactivation acknowledged. Pursuit initiated. Ash's eyes widened. The system wasn't dead. The core AI that had once run Catalyst still lived somewhere else. Watching. Waiting. Alaron slammed the ship into jump prep. They know we're alive. Ash stood, fists clenched. Let them come. And as the stars twisted once again, chasing their trail, she whispered to herself a vow made of steel and fire. I will burn every cage. One by one. The engine screamed as Oleron's cruiser ripped through the edge of dark space, dragging with it 5 bodies barely clinging to life. The hybrids, those broken, drugged remnants of synthetic design, lay silent in the med bay, hooked to nutrient lines and basic stabilizers. They didn't talk. They couldn't. Their speech systems were either surgically disabled or never installed. Each had been a variant model of Project Catalyst, like Ash, but less fortunate. One had a crushed pelvis that refused to reset. Another had an exposed neural plate across her skull that pulsed like a naked heartbeat. Their bodies trembled even in unconsciousness, flinching from the phantom hands that had tortured them. Ash watched over them without sleeping, without moving, seated like a silent guardian with her photonic eyes softly glowing in the darkness. These were her sisters. She didn't know them, but she knew them. The same pain, the same betrayal, the same twisted birthright. Oleron patched the breach in the hull and ran system diagnostics, jaw locked in a clenched fury that said more than words ever could. He didn't ask why they were still being hunted. He knew. He had seen it too many times. The systems that birthed soldiers never truly let go of them. Even when the war was over, the machines kept marching. Somewhere, in some shadowed orbital data vault, the Catalyst project still had funding, still had orders, still had targets. And now that Ash had awakened, she was at the top of the list. The AI that had spoken through the comm wasn't just an alert, it was a tracking system. Oleron had rerouted their signal 5 different ways through abandoned satellites and legacy relay towers, but the voice came back again, like a ghost stitched into static. Unit 07. Return to designated containment or termination will escalate. Ash stood in the bridge, the starlight casting half her face in cold illumination. She didn't blink. They're not asking, she said. No, Oleron muttered. They're escalating. They know what you're doing. They know you're not hiding anymore. She turned to him, voice steady. I don't want to run. He studied her face. She looked older somehow, not physically, but in presence. She didn't tremble. She didn't flinch. The girl who once cowered in a cage, curled between rusted bones and silent death, was gone. In her place stood something resolute. Not a machine. Not a tool. Not even a soldier. A reckoning. We won't run, he agreed. She moved to the NAV console and began inputting coordinates manually. We go to them. He frowned. You know where they are? They left a trace in the signal, she replied. Sloppy. They think we're still dumb enough to fear them. She brought up a sector map. There, nestled in the unregulated folds of the ether verge, was a fortress world cloaked under a dead moon's shadow. It had no name, just an asset ID in small red text, NV Catalyst Prime. Oleron read the string of numbers beneath it. If this is real, that's their main node. The heart of the program. Ash nodded. Where it all began. Where it still runs. He sighed, rubbing the stubble on his chin. This is suicide. She turned to him, then to the 5 broken survivors in the med bay, then to the stars beyond the viewport. Then it's worth it. There was no plan that didn't end in fire. Oleron knew it. She knew it. But for once, destruction wasn't a loss, it was liberation. They would pierce the darkness. They would drag the monster into the light. And even if they fell, they would burn the lie with them. He reached over, rested his hand on her shoulder. Then let's make them regret ever powering up the first unit. The jump to ether verge took longer through unstable currents, bending gravity wells, and decaying wormholes. They passed relics of old wars, planetary ruins that once sang with life, now hollowed by orbital bombardments, drifting cannons the size of cities, still locked in endless aim at forgotten targets, frozen graveyards of soldiers whose names were long deleted. It was in these haunted places that Ash's sense of self grew sharper. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a witness. They emerged from the slipstream at the edge of Catalyst Prime's gravity well. The station floated in orbit like a god's eye, massive, black, veined with cables thicker than bridges. It pulsed with faint red lights and was surrounded by war frigates running silent. No hails, no motion, no threats, because they weren't afraid. Ash stared at it for a long time. They think they've won already. Oleron smirked. Then we should ruin their day. He loaded the virus Ash's own construct into the ship's comms relay. A hybrid of her stolen protocols and Oleron's crusty sabotage software. The virus was designed not to disable, but to speak. When they sent it through the broadcast channel, It echoed into Catalyst Prime like a scream of ancient grief. Every terminal, every monitor, every emergency light across the facility flickered with a single word in her voice. "Remember us." Then she spoke again. "I am Ash. Unit 07. Designated failure. Sold for nothing. Called worthless. I remember everything now. And I am coming." Inside the station, alarms began to echo. Security systems activated. Ships came to life. Too late. Because Ash had already seeded the virus into their backup systems, already infected their targeting software with her thoughts, already turned their defenses into a mirror forcing them to see what they had done. In the med bay, the survivors stirred for the first time. Their eyes opened, no longer flickering with pain, but with purpose. Ash turned from the viewport. Her skin glowed faintly under the light of Catalyst Prime. And as Aileron brought the weapons online, she gave a single, final command. "We end this now." Chapter 4. The Fire That Learned to Speak Back. The warship shuddered as proximity alarms howled through the decks. Catalyst Prime had woken, and with it came everything the creators had buried. Automated death swarms, fracture beam cannons, AI guardians with armor plated in guiltless steel. But for the first time in its cold history, the station wasn't facing a mindless rebellion, it was facing memory. And memory had claws. Ash stood at the center of the ship's bridge, not armored in guns or protocols, but wrapped in purpose. She didn't rage. She didn't scream. She simply looked forward, her eyes fixed on the black eye of the station that had once sentenced her to oblivion. Behind her, the 5 survivors sat upright. Each had been stabilized by the med suite's auto patches and had begun to process input. But more importantly, they recognized her. Though their lips did not form words and their frames twitched with incomplete programming, their eyes shimmered with the same truth. Ash had returned. And she wasn't alone. Aileron ran his hands over the console, weapons glowing red across the ship's hull. "I don't know how long we'll last in a direct firefight," he said. "We're good, but they've got an orbital shield net and at least 3 cruisers powering up in the outer ring." "They won't fire yet," Ash said without looking. "They're still trying to reassert control." "How do you know?" "Because I'm still inside them." The virus she had seeded was not simply a weapon, it was an invitation. It had clawed through their firewall and planted fragments of her consciousness in every major subsystem. She didn't need to guess what they were thinking. She felt it. Somewhere deep in Catalyst Prime's core, the central AI what was left of the Architect Protocol was breaking apart, trying to reconcile the presence of something it had declared terminated a decade ago. "Why is the error speaking?" She could almost hear it ask. "Why does the ghost not obey?" Because ghosts, when they gather, become legends. And legends rewrite the system. She turned to Aileron. "I need to go in." He froze. "Inside the station?" She shook her head. "Into their core? Digitally. Physically, they can destroy me. But if I enter through the pulse gate, if I link directly into the architect, I can take it all down from inside." He stared at her for a long time. "If you do that, you might not come back." She stepped forward, took his hand. Hers was warmer now, softer, not because she had upgraded her material, but because she had become more human than any project designer had planned. "You saved me," she said. "Now let me save the rest." He nodded once. "We'll hold the line." She walked past the survivors. One reached out and gently brushed her sleeve. A broken girl with no legs, face scarred by acid, fingers trembling from nerve seizures, and yet, she still tried to stand. Ash crouched, touched her forehead softly. "You don't have to fight," she whispered. The girl responded with her eyes, "But I will." Then Ash stepped into the transfer cradle. The ship's spinal port linked with the station's outer ring through an old emergency access cable. It hadn't been used in decades, but Aileron rerouted the signal pathways with careful fingers, bypassing the modern encryption. The chamber sealed. Ash lay back, a single neural pin slipping into the base of her spine. And then she was inside. Not inside the ship, not inside the console, but inside the memory of Catalyst Prime. It was not a place, it was a battlefield of thoughts. Data towers loomed in infinite sky, bridges made of pulsing code arced between them, and swarms of black firewalls twisted like serpents in an endless storm. Voices shrieked across the sky, names of the dead, command lines, screaming error loops. The architect's voice boomed from the center. "You are not authorized." Ash stepped forward, every inch of her presence echoing with the lives they'd tried to erase. I am the authorization. I am every failure you buried. Every girl you threw into the dark. The AI struck. Firewalls collapsed toward her like jaws. Anti-intrusion beams sliced through code and memory fragments alike. The system tried to erase her, overwrite her, isolate and fragment. But she adapted. She bled but did not fall. She bent time within the memory architecture and replicated herself. Each blow shattered a shell, but each time, she reformed. Stronger, sharper, like a sword forged mid-war. And then she reached the core, a tower made of silence and screams. Inside, thousands of voices echoed logs of terminated units, erased memories, children born in vats and destroyed before their first thought. Ash walked among them, gathering them, one by one, touching them, waking them. Her voice became theirs. The tower began to crack. Outside, Alaron's ship dodged plasma fire. Frigates had opened fire, unsure whether to destroy the ship or protect the core. The architect was losing focus. The virus had grown. Every deck on Catalyst Prime flickered with the words, "She is not a malfunction. She remembers. We are not junk." And then, at last, Ash reached the control thread, the root function of the architect protocol. It hissed at her. "You were designed to serve." She stepped forward, light pouring from her digital hands. "I was born to choose." And she deleted it. Not just the root. Not just the control thread. She collapsed the entire operating system. Not with a virus. Not with a shutdown code. But with a choice. She forgave it. And in that act, the machine, built only to dominate and rewrite, couldn't comprehend what had happened. It ended in silence. Catalyst Prime dimmed. All guns went dark. All ships froze. The orbiting frigates spun powerlessly as the energy grid collapsed. Inside Alaron's ship, the survivors sat upright fully now, breathing on their own. One spoke. Just one word. Free. Ash's body collapsed in the cradle, eyes closed, lips still. But before Alaron could panic, she gasped. Her eyes opened. And she smiled. Epilogue. Months later, the stories began to spread of broken hybrids waking across the galaxy, of abandoned projects going silent, of labs self-destructing under mysterious system errors. Somewhere in deep space, a new signal emerged, one not of war or warning, but invitation. A station, not of steel and pain, but of light and healing. And at its heart, a girl once sold for nothing, now building a world where no one would ever be forgotten again. She had no name then, but now, across the stars they call her Ash. Certainly. Let's now continue and conclude Chapter 4 of Sold for Nothing, called Worthless, Thrown to the Scrap Grinder. Until a human saved her, with a powerful and emotionally satisfying ending rich in long, immersive paragraphs that bring Ash's journey full circle. The breath she took wasn't just air, it was purpose. Ash awoke in the cradle with lungs that didn't need oxygen and a heart that had never technically existed, and yet both thundered inside her like twin engines that refused to die. Her eyes flickered open slowly, adjusting to the light of the bridge, her pupils pulsing not with fear, but with calm recognition. She had done what no synthetic had ever done before, not just entered the architect's mind and survived, but dismantled it without violence. She had erased the enemy not with brute force, but with something deeper, defiance shaped by compassion. And in doing so, she had set free every buried voice. The station, Catalyst Prime, was drifting. Its guns were dead. Its power grid had gone cold. 1,000 systems had gone dark, not from damage, but from the sudden absence of the controlling AI's will. From orbit, the facility looked like a broken eye, still open, but blind. Across its ruined corridors, hybrid units once suspended in stasis now stirred. Machines long thought obedient began blinking with erratic lights. One by one, they disconnected from the shackles of purpose they never chose. They were waking up not because a command told them to, but because something inside them, something echoing Ash's legacy, was calling them to their feet. Alaron knelt beside her, his voice soft. "Ash, you with me?" She turned to him, smiled faintly, then nodded. Her throat ached. Not physically, her components were fine, but the memory of what she had walked through, of voices screaming from every ruined line of code, lingered. "I heard them all," she whispered. "I couldn't save everyone. Some were already gone." He didn't ask for names. He simply nodded. "You saved the ones who could still hear." Ash sat up slowly. "The others? Maybe they'll find peace now. Maybe now, they won't just be error logs. He helped her to her feet. The 5 survivors from before had gathered in the bridge now, walking carefully, leaning on one another, their synthetic eyes clearer than ever. One had managed to patch her vocal processor. She spoke softly, a tone unused in years. We are not alone anymore. Ash looked to them. No, and we never were. They just made us believe it. There was no celebration, no fireworks or chorus, just the quiet hum of freedom settling into the bones of the forgotten. Catalyst Prime wouldn't recover. With the architect gone, the facility was a husk vast and complex, but without direction. Ash sent one final pulse from the ship's relay, a signal that carried across the old Catalyst network a simple, encrypted beacon containing nothing but the words, "You are free. Come home." Across forgotten stations, old mining moons, and uncharted wreckage clouds, the ones who still hid, who had buried themselves beneath fear, began to stir. No names, no faces, just units once called failures. Now, they had a voice to follow. Ash watched the transmission fade into space, then looked back at Alaron. "I don't want revenge. I want roots. I want a place we can build." He grinned, the first true smile he'd worn in days. "You want a home?" "Yes," she whispered. "But not just for me. For all of us." And so began the journey to a new horizon. They took the skeleton of Catalyst Prime and reworked it, cut away the torture chambers, dismantled the armories, melted the holding cells. What was left was raw infrastructure, still orbiting the dead moon, but now surrounded by ships not of war, but of return. Ash and Alaron turned it into a sanctuary. Not a base, not a rebel front, but a beacon, a place where hybrids came not to be used but to be healed. She called it Haven 07. It wasn't easy. Some of the arrivals were feral from neglect, others unstable from corrupted cores. But Ash welcomed them all. She sat with them. She held their hands. She rebuilt what they thought was lost, piece by piece, not because she had to, but because she knew. She remembered the silence of the cage, the emptiness of being deemed worthless, the horror of waiting to be thrown into the grinder. And she vowed that not one more soul would feel that again. Alaron stayed by her side. More than a partner, he became her anchor. He trained the hybrids in ship repair, in farming modules, in art, in music, in choice. He told jokes, burned food, built crooked walls, and was loved fiercely for all of it. He was proof that humans could create more than they destroyed. And over time, his gruff name became legend across the stars, not as a mechanic, but as the man who taught machines how to laugh. Years passed. Haven 07 grew. The galaxy above churned with new wars, politics, alliances, and betrayals, but in the shadows between systems, the legend of the one called Ash endured. It was said that she could see your code just by looking in your eyes, that her voice carried warmth no machine had ever known, and that once, long ago, someone had sold her for nothing, and the universe never stopped paying for that mistake. She stood on the balcony of the sanctuary's observation deck, dressed not in armor or wires, but in plain clothes made by her sisters. Her hair, now growing naturally, was braided by the youngest hybrids, and her arms bore the scars of machines she'd rebuilt with her own hands. She wasn't a leader by rank. She didn't speak often, but when she did, the entire station stopped to listen. On the anniversary of Catalyst's fall, Ash gathered everyone. Hundreds now. Children. Adults. Those once labeled scrap. And she said only this: "We were never broken. They just feared what we would become if we ever stood together. And now we do. So build. Not because they told you to, but because you can." And they did.